Yeah. Family, y'all. Just keep it tight, keep it tight, keep it tight. All right. Yeah. Here we go, here we go.
It's written that God created man and He created woman. It seems that if we have that understanding in order to create a woman, and if God is referred to as a man, you would have to have a clear and thorough, integral understanding of what a woman would be to create one. And if that is the case, and you have a God that has an understanding. Now, if you consider that being God, male and female, then the word, as you express it, makes a lot of sense in that, not just in the birth of Christ, but in giving life to a human who is the Word and who is with God.
How fascinating, because we have this term called feminist liberation theology, which simply means it's women putting on their feminine glasses and looking at the scriptures and all these things that men wrote and imagining, how would this be different if it weren't written by the boys in the room, but if it were written by the girls in the room? What stories would be different? Because we live in an androcentric world, and the Bible was written in an androcentric world, which simply means what? It's centered. It was male-centered. The world in which the Bible was written was male-centered. Some of the other ancient cultures, we have some beautiful stories. In some cultures where God is not male in any way, but God was female. And how did God give birth to this world? It was imagined that God gave birth to this world in the same way that a woman gives birth to a child. Whoa! Are those stories in our Bible? Those stories are not in the Bible. Our Bible was written in an androcentric world. But how fascinating, if it were not written in an androcentric world, then why could God not become flesh in anyone outside the male gender? In an androcentric world, they were thinking, well, if God's going to become flesh, God would have to be a man. Remember the world in which the Bible was written? Men, women, there was not... Jesus had this radical idea, kicked off this discipleship of equals. Before then, it was an androcentric world in which he lived. So the Word becoming flesh is one of the central challenges in the Gospel of John, and it's certainly the challenge of Christology. John 1:14, and the Word became flesh, we said in Christology, that is the sword on which all heretics fall. If you don't believe that God became flesh in Jesus, then that's heresy. Christians, Orthodox Christians, believe that somehow God became flesh in the person of Christ, however that's to be understood. But it's fascinating to think about feminist liberation theology. Women in the past 60 years have greatly liberated the way that we think about these things. And I say in the past 60 years, simply meaning that anyone in this room and or outside of this room on this earth today could help us to continue taking those steps forward. But even for Jesus to tell stories that God is like a woman searching her house for a coin. God is like, what? That is the most absurd thing I've ever heard. Okay, God is like a sower throwing out the seeds. I can understand that. You're telling me God is like a woman searching her house for a lost coin? I mean, think of the liberating aspects of that story. That is God right there. You are God. You, women, embody God.
Well, it would not be contrary to the studies as far as God being having both aspects of humanness, correct?
In the book of Genesis, when God creates the human person, he says, let us create the human person in our image. The book of Genesis says, when God created us, he said, let us create the human person in our image. In our image? Did God have some sort of schizoid personality? In our image? And how did God create? God created man And woman, whoa, in our image. Genesis doesn't give us this image of a masculine man, God. It's of a God creating us, male and female, in God's image. Female in God's image.
So, since it was written in androcentric, maybe the guys who wrote it were just kind of macho and made it seem like a male has the power like God.
And there are those who suggest that those who are in power tend to like to hold on to power. And so if the boys are in power, what's going to happen? The boys are going to tend to want to keep it. Remember back to second grade when we would fight boys versus girls. If the girls are in power, what's going to happen? They're going to keep it as well. Those who are in power tend to want to keep it. And so we try to keep others in subservient positions. So since men were in power at that time, it was finding ways to tell women that they were subservient in whatever ways. Whether that was excluding women from ministry, I'm sorry, but woman, know thy place. I mean, it's difficult for us with 21st century ears in North America, in the United States of America, where we have this belief that men and women are equal. It's hard for us to hear those words. But in many places around the world today, even in the 21st century, we recognize that that equality has yet to be achieved. Even in the United States, when we look at the pay received by men and women, we realize that Jesus' vision and Paul's vision, where there is no male or female, slave or free, Jew or Greek, that vision is not yet accomplished among us. But it's a great vision for us to keep holding up and striving toward ourselves and challenging others to strive toward as well.
So I have to say one more thing and related to that, and that is that I appreciate that the Bible still says what it's supposed to say regarding the creation in the beginning. So there's been some discussion on that.
You were asking if there's been some discussion on...
Why did they keep that in the Bible? I mean, if it's the boys are in charge, then why did they not change it?
So why did we keep the language of God creating us in God's image, male and female?
In our image.
That's an excellent question.
Was there a debate? And the resolution was to leave it? I mean, has that not been in question?
So ultimately, Bultmann, we remember that name from our course in Christology. Bultmann was the one who tended to look at stories like that and see them as myths. So that, for instance, when you come to the creation myth, or the creation story if you prefer, okay, what is that author trying to say? I mean, ultimately, in any creation myth, you have to explain where people come from. Okay, so if you have a male god, then I can explain where Deacon Cleophas comes from. But Dulce, I have no idea how to explain where Dulce comes from, because Dulce is different from Deacon Cleophas. Follow me? Mm-hmm. And so how do you explain where they come from? Genesis 2, okay, there's a story about God taking a rib out of the man and taking some mud and forming around and breathing into whatever God did at that point. Okay, so that woman was made from man. Man, the ancient root means from man. Okay, was that the case?
I said, wool.
Was that the case? And it's interesting for us to take a look at these stories, because somehow we have to explain how it is that we're all different in this room, and if men are different from women, then where did men come from and where did women come from? And the ancient author of the first chapter of Genesis was different from the author of the second chapter. Remember that from our course when we were talking about the Pentateuch? Two different people wrote chapter 1 and chapter 2. Whoever wrote chapter 1 had this idea of explaining men and women both coming from God in God's image. Chapter 2, slightly different here. The woman is made out of rib.
I wasn't there, so I'll accept what the Bible says, Father. I'm just wondering, what the
So there
theology.
are two stories by two different authors saying two different things and giving us two different views of God and of ourselves. With the Gospels, at least 4, if not more, different authors giving us different views on Jesus and on the human being. Another example that we'll come to in a bit is demonic possession. Do you remember in our Synoptic Gospels we had different stories of how it is that Jesus cast out spirits? How many of those are we going to see in John? John said, possessed by demons? That's a bunch of hooey, right? different perspectives, not only on God, but also on us. John's looking at that possessed person saying, that person's not possessed. I've never seen a possessed person, and Jesus never expelled demons. Interesting. So we're talking about views of God and views of us, which is why we often say that theology is anthropology. What is anthropology the study of? Anthropology is the study of us, human beings. What's theology the study of? God, our image of God, and our image of the human being. They fit together. What you believe about God tells me a lot about what you believe about the human person.
If you look at Cleopatra, she was a woman in charge of Egypt. But if you read her stories and read the stories about her, she was a masculine person because men wrote the stories. She didn't write her own story. She was a nurturing person of Egypt at the time. That's why she was in power so long. But all they write about is how the Egyptian empire took over everything. They made her masculine. So this is just basically almost the same as the Bible, where it was androcentric.
So Cleopatra, that's a great example, only because if a man writes a story about Cleopatra, that may be different from a woman's story about Cleopatra. Why? Because that man has no idea what it would be like to be Cleopatra, in the same way that a woman...
And if she's a leader, she must be masculine because leaders are men.
Yeah, because they don't write the stories about how she became the woman to make the first dam, to get water for her people and everything else. All they write is about the empire that she built, being as a masculine.
So how interesting, how in the Gospel of John, in the Johannine school then, what we're going to see are different views, not only of God and of Jesus, but different views of ourselves as well. Anyone who writes any of these books or letters in the Bible is going to have his or her own view of the situation. Is going to be telling us what he or she believes about God and what he or she believes about the human person.
We